And welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Hannah White. I'm a programme director here and I'm leading our programme of work on Brexit. As everyone here is aware, the referendum will lead to profound changes in the way the UK is governed. And this is the first in a series of events that we're going to be holding here at the Institute, where we plan to be at the heart of the debate, exploring the implications of the UK's decision to leave the EU. Now, the Institute's work on Brexit is going to be looking not only at the subject of the event here today, how Whitehall prepares for negotiations, but we'll also be looking at the possibilities for the UK's future relationship with the EU, whether that's Norway, Canada, a bespoke model, and how the negotiations we undertake can achieve the best possible outcome for the country. We'll also be looking at the implications for the Union. So what does this mean for Scotland, Northern Ireland, and for English cities? And finally, we'll be taking a step back to look at issues around the governability of the UK. So the apparent breakdown in traditional party structures and the connection between politicians and the public in a post-Brexit reality. But today, we're here to focus on the implications for Whitehall, both for the civil service and for politicians. So for the civil service, Brexit has obviously created a number of challenges: how best to prepare for and support negotiations, how to deal with any economic turbulence and contingencies which arise, and how to continue, of course, to deliver business as usual. And for politicians, there's the not inconsiderable challenge of delivering what the public think they voted for. We're delighted to have assembled a fantastic panel here today, and really they need no introduction, but working from my left to my right, we have Bernard Jenkin MP, obviously Chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and a leading parliamentary voice in the who is arguing for the UK to leave the EU. Julian McCrae, who is Deputy Director of the Institute for Government, who will be highlighting some of the Institute's thinking about priorities for the civil service and their connection to wider issues facing Whitehall. Melanie Dawes, who's Permanent Secretary of DCLG and Chair of the Civil Service People Board, and thus a member of the core civil service leadership team. Lord Andrew Turnbull, who obviously has a wealth of experience in the civil service, having been Permanent Secretary of the Treasury and Cabinet Secretary. And last but not least, Jane Dudman, who is a leading commentator on public sector issues and editor of the Guardian Public Leaders Network. Now, every panellist has been asked to speak for around 6 minutes. I can warn you I'm going to be very strict with them because we want to leave plenty of time for questions from the floor. Couple of housekeeping points. Toilets are across the landing and the fire escape route is down the stairs you came up now to the front door. And if you're tweeting, please feel free to use the hashtag IFGBrexit. So without further ado, can I invite Bernard to begin?
Thank you very much indeed. And I am infinitely conscious of what a sobering moment we've had in the history of our country. And personally, I felt very little triumph. I felt chastened by the reaction and disappointment of people who did not vote to leave the European Union and feel passionately that this country's done the wrong thing. They voted the wrong way. And I think we have to be very mindful as we go forward to reunite the country, to bring all the forces together to enable this country to make the best of the opportunities that lie in front of us. We have to be very mindful of the different feelings and different perspectives that exist in any room where this is going to be discussed in Whitehall or anywhere else. So I start by saying something about the atmosphere that we're working in, which I think is very germane to the question of what now for Whitehall. And Whitehall needs to have the mindset and the capacity to be positive about the present situation, to provide leadership. I think a lot of business is feeling there's a great dearth of leadership at the moment. And in the absence of a new Prime Minister, it's going to take some time to provide that leadership but I think Whitehall needs to be thinking how Whitehall fills in for that leadership in the intervening period, curious as that may seem. Second, what the country actually voted for, you put in your introduction. There's been quite a lot of discussion about how this should be interpreted, whether they really meant it, whether the people who voted for it really have valid views, even as been suggested. But I don't think we should have any doubt that, about what the result is telling us. The biggest ever plebiscite, the biggest ever vote, single vote in our country's history, the biggest number of people ever who voted for a single party or a single proposition, against the background of overwhelming opposition to leaving the European Union from all the respectable voices, the economists, the city, the industrial leaders, the Whitehall, the establishment, the universities, the scientists, and with one other huge advantage for the Remain campaign, which was the status quo is usually very difficult to overturn in a referendum. 2 out of 3 referendums around the world would go for the status quo. And Purdah only applied for 28 days. The Electoral Commission always said it should be longer. With all those advantages to the Remain camp, for the Leave to have won on that basis, I think tells us something. And have no doubt, when I was in my constituency on the day, there were queues of people outside polling stations where traditionally not many people vote. And this subject, for some reason, engaged people in our democratic system in a way that, this debate, I should say, engaged people in this democratic system in the way that I've never seen in my lifetime before. And I think and the point is, talking to those people, they knew what they were voting for. They were voting for a system of national democracy as opposed to a system of European government. And we can argue whether that was a proper analysis or a proper understanding, but we are where we are. And I think any idea of sort of cavilling about the result, of trying to ameliorate it or turn it back, well, I think it's exposed by Jeremy Hunt's article in the Telegraph on Tuesday, where he suggested there should be, that we would do a sort of Norway Plus agreement, but we'd need a second referendum. I think if the establishment tries to second guess this incredible vote, we are going to create the canvas on which the extremists will paint their ugly scenes. We will have more racist attacks. I think it's up to the two-party system in this country, which we have, to understand what has happened and respond accordingly. So that's the atmosphere. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to overrun my time. So what is it that needs to be done? If you accept the result, it means leave means leave. It means leave means take back control of our borders. It means we're going to have an immigration policy that is determined by this country, and it's not going to be ameliorated in favour of some European interest against, for example, the Commonwealth citizens, many of whom in this country now live and voted for leave precisely because they are against the discriminatory immigration system that we have practiced as a member of the European Union. Leave means leave the single market, means being outside the single market. And there's a lot of myth, I think, said about access to the single. Whenever somebody says we need access to the single market, I always ask what they mean. We're going to be outside this regulatory structure, outside the 4 freedoms, outside the court and the institutions of the European Union. And to get there, we can't spend 5 years. If we have 5 years of this kind of uncertainty, we really will wreck the economy. The only reason the economy is looking a little bit rocky at the moment is because there's nobody got a plan. If there was direction and leadership and a plan, we need to move quickly, and we need to move to a situation where we can leave the European Union quickly. And that is done by principally by one thing. It is done by an Act of Parliament. And there's an article in the Civil Service World, which you may have seen, it's going to be in the House magazine as well, about this whole relationship with Article 50. We join the EU by an Act of Parliament, we leave by an Act of Parliament. Even if we invoke Article 50, we still need an Act of Parliament. And the principle of this Act of Parliament is 2 things. One is it suspends all our European Community obligations, it suspends the application of European Community law in our land, but it has also a carryover provision, so all the regulation and directives that applying our law under European law, in our own law, are carried into statute law by this Act of Parliament. And then there's a coming into force provision so we can trigger it when we need it. And we should be aiming at, and I don't think Whitehall is in this mindset yet, we should be aiming at having this legislation on the statute book soon, before we trigger Article 50, if at all, if we trigger Article 50 at all. The great danger of Article 50 is it was put into the treaties to make it more difficult and complicated for a state to leave the European Union. It puts the United Kingdom into a binding process, ironically, which the British people have just voted against. That we've just voted against being in any binding process in the European Union. It would be ironic that we tip ourselves into a binding process. But I can see that it would be acceptable to use Article 50 as a kind of exchange and completion of contracts, but we shouldn't enter Article 50 until we know what the outcome of being in Article 50 would be. And the bottom line is, if we want to negotiate from a position of strength, the bottom line is we don't need a deal. We can leave the EU without a deal, except for transitional arrangements. And this is what we should be planning to do, and this is what Whitehall needs to prepare for, that all the complicated stuff, even customs union arrangements, could be put into transitional arrangements and dealt with after we have left the EU, after we've taken back sovereign control of all these matters. And the negotiation with the EU, I mean, we will need, to set up machinery permanently to have a relationship with the European Union that we haven't had before. And there will be a great acceleration of issues and tasks and things to be done before we leave and after we leave, which Whitehall needs to be configured for. But the principle is that we could leave quickly, leave cleanly, and take these things back under our control and negotiate with our European partners and with the European Union as a sovereign state rather than as a member of the European Union. And finally, what does it mean for Whitehall, all this? Well, there is a debate going on as to whether you create some Secretary of State role with a department that's going to handle all these matters, or whether you create a small unit in the Cabinet Office under the Permanent Secretary, Ollie Robbins, whom I congratulate on his challenging appointment, but will be essentially coordinating the other departments more along the Haldane model. And I personally, I find a lot of my ex-ministerial colleagues are very keen on the idea of seizing control in some great department. But I always ask this test question: how many Secretaries of State are there in the government? Anybody? How many? Too many, somebody said. Well, I can tell you in law there's only one. In law there is only one. The Secretary of State, written into legislation, is one. And in this matter, the Prime Minister is the Secretary of State. If the Prime Minister is not steering this process, him or herself, through the Cabinet Office, through the Cabinet, through the machinery of government, how will we carry the departments with us? And there are going to be many silos of tasks that will need to be carried. So personally, that is my view at the moment. My committee, and I'll end on an invitation. My committee has actually been asked by Oliver Letwin, and I'm having meetings with officials tomorrow, to draw up a short paper on 3 or 4 sides of paper about, to prompt some thinking about what we need to do in Whitehall to enable this process to happen as swiftly and as efficiently as possible. And I mean, you will be familiar with, the shortages of skills, the lack of capacity, all the extra things that departments are going to have to do. I mean, the Foreign Office could be reduced to becoming purely reactive to world events if it becomes completely absorbed in this. I wonder whether we should have a call-up of reserves, if you like, from recently retired senior officials and others who have recently left the civil service, come back and help with. It's not stupid. It's serious. We're going to need lots of people to do lots of things and have capacity to do things. Maybe it's a silly idea. Shoot it down. It's an idea. We're going to need to train people in how to in the matter of trade deals. I had a meeting this morning with a Swiss trade minister. Absolutely fascinating to hear how they have been negotiating successfully and swiftly free trade deals on a bilateral basis around the world. It's not complicated, but it is complicated. But there are some simple things you can learn. We know that most things are very difficult until you know how to do them, and then they become much easier. And we're going to need to use, say, John Manzoni's Civil Service Leadership Academy, which is still in nascent form, perhaps to accelerate a training of a new cadre of of skilled officials in trade negotiations. It's those things that are going to need to be tackled. I've probably spoken long enough. Thank you very much.
Julian.
Thanks, Hannah. I think whatever we're talking about here, we have to face the fact that Whitehall needs to produce a strategic response to the situation it's in. The tactical manoeuvring that sometimes we engage in is not going to cut it for the things we are facing up to. I'd like to have a quick, therefore, look at what I think some elements of such a strategic response would look like. 3 things I want to touch on: the preparation we need to do now, the prioritisation we're going to need as we go forward, and finally the personalities side of this. Now that last thing, personalities, you wouldn't normally stick into a strategic response, but we know in Whitehall personalities matter, and therefore we've got to face up to that and to deal with that. So let me start with some of the preparation. There's a sort of A101 of responding to uncertainty and crisis, and that's do it on the basis of facts, not your fears. And I think practically for Whitehall, it's really important that we use our analytical capacity now and start to respond to some of the issues that are coming up. And we know there's fiscal pressures, there's questions about retaining some of the overseas workforce in places like the NHS, all sorts of things that people can raise. We need to be looking now at what are the measures we're going to be examining to know whether or not those fears, those anxieties are turning into real problems we have to deal with, or whether they're actually going to turn out to be things that, while they might have happened, they didn't really, and we need to be concentrating elsewhere. And we certainly don't need to be arguing about what the basis of that assessment is or which numbers we should be looking at as we move forward. Second thing I'd say in the preparation, this needs to be a civil service-wide response to what we're facing. It's not going to be a sum of departments operation. We've already seen that. The civil service has already put in place the EU unit in the Cabinet Office. Very necessary move. There's wider issues on skills and capabilities that we're going to need to look at. It's going to become clear when we need them and what form we need them in. So for a moment, EU intelligence is absolutely essential to us. We need to know where 27 countries are going to be coming from and how we might want to have to interact with them. Things like trade, it's going to come. We're going to need to do it. But you can find trade negotiators around the world, and actually BIS, while it hasn't done trade negotiations, has people inside it that know what a trade negotiation is and can similarly plan for bringing in that resource when we're going to need it. But with those plans for how the civil service brings in that resource, and not a competition between departments, the worst thing we could have to attract the best talent into themselves. Third thing inside the preparation, we need to clear the decks. We know there's a huge amount coming down the road towards us. We also know there's a very large backlog of decision making inside Whitehall. Now, some of that backlog is contentious politically. It can't be touched at the moment. Some of it's so contentious it can probably be killed off at the moment because it's never going to get to decision. But there are a lot of things in Whitehall that are important. They have to happen, but they're not contentious. It's important that we have a cabinet in place at the moment that can still work through that business and clear a little bit more headroom for what we're going to need in the autumn. I know there's a political campaign going on, but actually our system is capable of running a political campaign and running the processes of government. On prioritisation, the other second of my sort of things. I mean, Bernard's talked about one of the ways that we need to establish what's our new relationship going to be with the EU and indeed the rest of the world. There's a lot going on, if we listen to, in the leadership campaign at the moment, people setting forward views, and that campaign itself will hopefully help to show us and prioritise what is it we really care about in the UK, what else do we have to trade inside that. And that clarity can only come from the political side, and I'm sure the process will get there, but it can't be fudged. It is a very serious operation, as we all know, for a set of negotiations. But there are other issues that need prioritisation beyond Brexit. We have existing deficit plans and plans to reduce spending in public services. You know, those plans are linked with political commitments to maintain the quality of those services. The squaring of that circle is in things like investment in digital, in decentralisation, bringing in new providers. All of those things have to work for those plans to succeed, and all of those things are inherently risky in themselves. Have we got the bandwidth to push those through and to make them happen? We need to have a hard-headed decision. If we don't have that bandwidth, then we have to come up with alternative plans. And those are the types of choices and the realities that we've got to face. It's no good ignoring it, and it's certainly no good saying we'll have the nice bits of those plans and we'll ignore the bad bits because we'll hope they won't happen. The final thing I wanted to touch on was personalities. Now, there is an issue about how ministers are going to interact with the civil service. The one thing we know about Whitehall, politics is always the determinant of what ultimately happens. And it is ministers and politicians who will set the tone for that relationship. And that relationship, and given the situation, it's bound to be challenging. It's bound to be challenging for everyone. But there has to be space left inside that to allow trusted relationships to rapidly develop. If they don't develop, we will be hobbling ourselves at a moment when the country is looking to Whitehall, political and official, to take up huge challenges. And similarly inside that, though, there are issues for civil service. We know Whitehall knows its ministers very well. It knows what works for them as individuals, and even knows who works with them as individuals. And we have to take that into account to make sure that we aren't hobbled by a period of indecision. Final point I wanted to make on this. There are wider issues about how ministers run in Whitehall departments. All the politicians I know are very comfortable with our concept that ministers are at the heart of their departments. They work with their leading and top civil servants. There are alternative systems around the world. In Australia, ministers are surrounded by quite large offices, and those offices interact with the departments. Now, it's not necessary that the UK maintains its current system, though, as I say, I very rarely meet a politician who wants to move away from it, but it is a system that you can move away from pretty quickly by accident. If we want to make such a move, we should do it strategically and by design, and think about what that actually means, because otherwise, again, we hobble ourselves with chaos in the early stages. So those are just some initial thoughts on what a strategic response might look like. But above all, I think going back to the first point, it's facts and not fears we need to be operating on. In governing, you have to be using the information, and you have to be capable of agreeing what the information is if you're going to allow yourself to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So we've heard what the Institute thinks civil service ought to be thinking about. Now we get to hear what they are thinking about from Melanie.
Thank you very much. And just to say thank you for inviting us to be here today and to tell you what we are doing and what we're gearing up to do as well. So the first thing to say is actually I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I think I won't comment on what Bernard said about the use of Article 50 or not. I think in the end that's a policy choice that ministers will have to make. But I do agree with a lot of what you've been saying about the need to orchestrate a very sort of coordinated response here. And perhaps I'll just say a little bit about what that could actually mean in practice and in terms of structures. The first thing to say is that we have a couple of months here while a new leader of the Conservative Party is chosen, and so we will have a new Prime Minister in September with a team who will be surrounding him or her as their cabinet and their wider ministerial team. And so what we're doing during that time in the civil service, working across the existing ministerial team, but also through Oliver Letwin, working to reach into the views in the wider Conservative Party, and also as actively as we can engaging external views as well, and certainly the devolved administrations, to try to be as ready as we can in September so that that new political team can hit the ground running with a sense of what are the big decisions, the big options and the big choices, and where do we need to focus our effort immediately and then over the months that follow. As you know, Oliver Robbins was appointed yesterday to lead a new unit at the centre. I think that's a fantastic appointment. I know many of you will know Ollie. He's got, I think, just the right balance of experience here. He's worked out the centre. He also knows what it's like to run things in departments. So he is now, he's going to be starting, I think, early next week. But he's already thinking, and I had a chat with him last night about how he's going to approach this. One of his early tasks is going to be to work out exactly the scale of resourcing that is needed in his unit and what needs to remain in departments. And I think that's going to be one of the key balancing acts for us as we go through this. We're going to need to enhance and grow the existing central unit in the Cabinet Office, which I know Brian led some years back, Aegis as it's currently known, the European and Global Issues Secretariat. That is going to definitely be joined by some extra people from the Foreign Office, the Treasury and BIS as well. And they will be working very closely with UCREP, which again is a very strong part of the British system, much admired by other countries. And if anything is a really good example of how you orchestrate something that is genuinely cross-Whitehall, genuinely cross-government, I think UCREP is that. If for anybody who's ever come into contact with it, it's genuinely cross-department. When you go there, you meet the people there in Brussels who represent the UK, you wouldn't know which department they were from. And I think that's what Ollie's unit needs to be at the centre in London as well. So the work has started. This is, I think, certainly to begin with, a classic Cabinet Office job. I myself led the Economic and Domestic Secretariat for 3.5 years until the beginning of last year. And this sort of Cabinet Office role is about a combination of coordination that lets other departments get on with the work they need to get on with, but also very strong centralisation where necessary to support, ultimately, as Bernard said, the Prime Minister, who will be leading the government, and I'm sure absolutely leading this negotiation and all the work that needs to be done. A lot of people are asking, do we have enough resources? And I think, we know that in some areas the answer is clearly no, we don't. We are going to need trade negotiators. There may be some other areas like lawyers where we're going to need to increase the number of people that we've got. I think, though, it's a moot point for me as to whether this is about overall civil service numbers. A lot of people have said, well, we've actually reduced in numbers. It's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the reductions that have been made in the last few years have been in the service delivery departments, where they've introduced clear kind of initiatives in places like HMRC, for example, that have allowed the workforce to be smaller. They've used technology, they've used prioritisation, and a number of other tools and techniques. Whitehall, central Whitehall, is smaller as well, but I think it's not necessarily the case for me that small is necessarily a problem here. What we need is just to be good. We need to be good, we need to be skilled, and above all, I would say we need to be flexible and collective. And if there's one opportunity I think we have here that we really need to seize, it is for a more collective sense of Whitehall in the civil service, certainly. And what I mean by that is that, yes, we're going to have a central unit. Yes, some departments, such as, for example, DEFRA or BIS, are going to be very affected by this. Other departments, such as my own, DCLG, are affected to some extent, but not in everything that we do, certainly not directly anyway. And what I think we need to get to in our leadership across the civil service is a sense that we work in a more concerted way, a more conscious way, sharing our resourcing pressures, sharing our resources where necessary, certainly sharing our allocation of top talent, and acting more collectively, quicker to move things around when we need to. And I think, in the last Parliament, interestingly, actually, partly as a result of some of the changes, the civil service reforms that were brought in, on digital, on commercial, for example, we showed that we could do this. And we began some of the difficult conversations that you always have. And I mean, I'm sure the people in this room who've worked in large organisations, and you have those awful conversations about sharing your best people, and when someone's coming to talk to you and there's a people committee or whatever, that you're going to be asked to give up your best deputy. I've experienced that. And it's partly about recognising that's going to happen a bit and being ready for it emotionally and in terms of our leadership. I think that's actually quite exciting for the civil service, but I also think it's necessary. Finally, I think this is a new lens for us all, and again, I agreed with what Bernard said at the beginning. This is significant. This is a very big change in the way that the country is going to be governed. It's 43 years worth of an EU framework, and that's going to be different from now on. All of us in this room, I suspect, have pretty much grown up in that framework, and I think whether you were leave or remain. And I think it is important to acknowledge the emotion, actually, on both sides that's still there. And that's part of the leadership role that certainly in the civil service we've been allowing for in the last week or so. But it's also actually about intellectually, and I think, again, this is a very collective task, needing to recognise that we are all looking through a rather different lens here. And it's going to take us a while to work out what that means. And I think there will be some areas that surprise us where we go, actually, hadn't thought of that, hadn't realised that that was going to be affected by this decision. So allowing for us to evolve our thinking here, as well as to act urgently and quickly where we need to, is an important part, I think, of thinking this through. The final point I would make is it's certainly true that this is going to be one of the biggest changes, I think, that the civil service has experienced and had to support ministers in leading the country through. But I would also say that the civil service has many times over, both when there have been changes of government and sometimes within governments, had to respond and change and sometimes turn on a sixpence. If I can go back to imperial measurements briefly, turn on a sixpence and look in a different direction. And we know we can do it, we've done it before. It's not easy, it's not always easy to manage, we don't always manage it brilliantly, but we've got a lot of track record in this space, we've done a lot of work with the IFG on how to make it work and so on. I think, and it picks up what Julian was saying, it's going to be so important here that we have trust. If you trust a system, you can make it move so fast for you. And all my experience tells me that where we can trust across Whitehall, between the civil service and ministers, but actually also between the government and people working outside, and dare I say it, close relationships with Parliament here, I think also very, very important. Starting on an assumption of trust, I think, is quite important for us as we approach this. We'll get further, faster, better if we do. And that also allows for honesty if we need to change what we're doing along the way as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we get the chance to hear some of that experience that civil service will draw.
Well, we start with a political crisis first and foremost, which needs to be sorted out very quickly. One party, the Conservatives, divided, I would say, vertically. Labour divided horizontally between its parliamentary leadership. The Conservatives are now beginning to make moves and so offer the prospect of sorting this out by early September. What will happen on the Labour side, I don't know. But getting that settled quickly is a sort of precondition to what goes next. Meanwhile, the civil service can provide and is providing continuity. A lot of work, mostly unspoken, has been done on contingency arrangements. I don't know whether it's because they're working or because they haven't been needed, but where we are now is really quite remarkable. That the stock exchange is roughly where it was about a month ago, an exchange rate of 134 against the dollar and 120 against the euro. These are not numbers that represent panic or serious distortions in markets. So that stage of creating some degree of stability, I think, has been achieved, and the bank, Treasury and civil service need some credit for that. What will the civil service do? Well, it will start with the philosophy that doing what it has always done before, which is it serves the government of the day. And I think Julian is quite wrong to suggest that now is the time to have a rethink about this constitutional arrangement. At one point you were saying we should concentrate on our priorities. A long debate about an alternative constitutional relationship between ministers and civil servants. This is not the time to do that. Equally, I don't accept Bernard's mindset arguments. Civil servants work for the government of the day. They do turn on a sixpence and have done so. There have been many changes of government, many changes of policy, and they take direction from ministers, provided ministers are clear enough to offer those directions. So what is it doing now? Well, it's pretty clear that, and this is where I agree with Bernard, that we're not in a rush to invoke Article 50. This is a bit like ordering your taxi and starting the meter running an hour before you need it. All that time, the 2-year period, is our time and it's valuable. Therefore, we should delay this until we are absolutely ready to go into the negotiations. And possibly delay it if they then say, well, I'm too busy, I've got a German election or a French election. That period, we have the kind of upper hand while waiting. Once we get into that 2-year period, it is the balance advantage shifts the other way. I don't agree with the argument of unilaterally saying we're just going to repeal this and repeal that. That may be fine to deal with our end of things, but it doesn't deal with the other end of things, the relationship. And the relationship going forward will be as important as the immediate impact of leaving. That also was the conclusion reached by the House of Lords European Affairs Committee. They believe that we should follow the Lisbon Treaty, Article 50, but by playing hardball on timing. What is now being set up, combining Aegis, the Treasury team, Foreign Office team, and a BIZ, the residual 20-30 people in BIZ, will create a strong team. I saw Ollie Robbins outside the Cabinet Office and I said, cometh the hour, cometh the man. I think it's as good a choice as you can find. It will be about 250 people. And in some ways, it is a bit like an embryonic, the unit that Geoffrey Rippon led between 1970 and the end of 1972. It was in the Cabinet Office. There is an interesting piece. I looked up Geoffrey Rippon in Wikipedia, and it said, in 1970 became Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster under Edward Heath, and being in favour of the common market, was given responsibility for negotiating Britain's entry. And the question is whether the same applies in reverse. Now, what has got to be done of this central group? Well, it's got to, first of all, I think there's a kind of scoping exercise. What needs to be done and in what sequence, and which negotiating tactics are we going to follow? This early work needs to be ready in time for an arrival of a new Prime Minister and administration. It is not, in my view, terribly different from the kind of briefing you do for an election or for a change of Prime Minister, but it needs to be done quickly and it needs to be done well. There's then got to be some idea of breaking it down into its components. I don't think this unit should regard itself as the European department. It is the coordinating unit and it sets this negotiating strategy. But eventually you have to get down to the level of individual departments. There's also, someone's got to look very carefully at legislation. What do we junk? I can think of a few things. What do we simply want to transpose into UK legislation, and what do we want to repeal and start again? For example, our farming regime. The next is this question of the relationship with the devolved administrations. We're hearing a lot of noise coming from Scotland. My view is that the Scots' bargaining position is nowhere near as strong as they think it is. They have realised that their budgetary position is very weak. A deficit of the size they would now have would never have got them into the euro, 8-9% of GDP. They have no central bank. They'd have to get into the euro and they'd have to satisfy its conditions. They would lose all the generosity of the Barnett formula. Does it need? Okay. And they would have to start paying a contribution. So they may huff and puff, but I think they would find that life would be pretty difficult for them. Staffing, people are absolutely right. I think this unit will have staff of the numbers and calibre to perform its kind of central coordinating role. When you get down to the level of individual departments, there will be, let's say, 20 different dossiers, some of them huge, like agriculture, and the trade, freedom of movement dossier. There's also a very important dossier about the acquired rights of EU citizens living here and British citizens living over there, which needs to be settled very, very quickly. Departments will need policy analysts. They will need sector specialists. Someone's got, the pharmaceutical industry or patents or whatever. They will need negotiators and they will need lawyers. Now, Jeremy Hayward tells me that he's inundated with offers from professional services firms, from consultants, etc., etc. So in this unit, I think you need an HR director, not simply to look after the 250 people, but to work on a basis on which people can come in, a new kind of temporary contract, so to speak, that maybe it's 3 or 4 years, possibly extendable, that we can bring talent in. It's pretty much what was done in the war, actually. And you read Peter Hennessy's book, and there was a woman who was in charge of this whole operation of finding talent and bringing it all in. There's the issue of trust has been raised. Well, there is a trust deficit. I would say there's a very big trust deficit in our system, but it isn't in the civil service. The civil service, if you look at the Ipsos Mori poll, has polled this thing for 35 years. Our rating is pretty steady, pretty near 60%, and given the company we keep in Whitehall and Westminster, that's pretty remarkable. This is nearly 40 percentage points higher than over the road. And that is where principally the whole area of trust needs to be addressed. I think that's probably it from me.
So what I'm going to do is just widen out the question a little bit. I've been a Guardian journalist now for 9.5 years, and actually I'm a tiny bit nervous about having been here for nearly an hour already, because God only knows what's happened out in the world. But because it's that kind of a week, that kind of a time. But in that 9.5 years, I write as I'm the editor of the Public Leaders Network, and if you don't know, it's our online section where we write about public leadership and policy generally across all public services. So I write not only about the civil service but about local government as well. And in those 9.5 years, we've had some interesting reactions whenever we write about the civil service. The piece that I wrote earlier on this year, this just shows you, doesn't it? The piece that was actually published on Tuesday online. Yeah, that's just how it feels, sorry. Saying about how it's the absolute role of the civil service now to keep a steady hand on the tiller, effectively, whilst the government and the politicians are working out what they can do. I have never had such positive comments to a piece about the civil service. We usually get the kind of, you can imagine the kind of things we usually get, but we didn't. Really, really positive feedback on the role of the civil service at this time, and I think that's absolutely important to bear in mind. However, I do think there are some things that we do need to think about where Whitehall is right now as it goes forward. And one of those, really importantly, is what is the morale of the civil service? And I completely agree with Melanie that, we're in a reasonable, we've made a lot of progress has been made since the 2012 civil service reform plans. But whether that has moved quickly enough, so that whether there really is a Whitehall that is now an agile and lean force is still a question in my mind. And I think it's really important that this should be thought of across the whole of the public service. This isn't just a Whitehall issue, but even if we think of it in terms of what Whitehall itself is doing, it would be a great mistake, I think, to set up a kind of central agile unit that looks across Whitehall without remembering that actually what's going to be necessary here is the whole of the rest of Whitehall, the whole of the rest of the civil service and the whole of the rest of the public service. So I think that's one thing. And I do think that things have not moved fast enough, and that some of the ways in which change has been carried out in the civil service over the past few years have not resulted in a civil service that, to be honest, is now champing at the bit to take this forward. I know that it will be professionally done, I know all of that, but just in terms of the way that the morale that we see, the feedback that we get from civil servants, and there are two, there's the present Secretary of the FDA Union and the former Secretary of the FDA Union are both in the room, and I know they will have many things to say precisely on the impact that the cuts have had. And this isn't just about cuts, no, I absolutely agree again, it's about being good and flexible. But the way in which some of the cuts have been made, and in particular, the feeling that there's been an onslaught, basically, on jobs and terms and conditions. People have talked about trust, but I think that many people are not feeling very trusting in the system right now as it stands, and some of the aspects of the new system, in particular the performance management system that now prevails in the civil service. It's the PCS union, as many of you will know, is actually having a week of action against the performance management system. We have very strong, people write to us very strong feelings about that system. That's just one small aspect, but I think it does speak about morale, and I think it does speak to political leadership, and whether we have actually, had the leadership that's taken the civil service with it as it's gone forward and seek to make these reforms, or whether in fact it has not taken the civil service with it in that way that you might hope. Other people have spoken about skills, so I won't go into that. I only to say that I think it's a shame that the civil service reform plan, the idea of creating a more agile civil service, hasn't been implemented more quickly. I think there have been problems with that. And the only other thing I'll say at this point, so that we can get to the Q&A, is that looking at the wider issues, I was in Manchester on Tuesday talking about the impact of infrastructure investment on the Northern Powerhouse. The potential impact of this agenda on those kinds of policies, local government in particular is very poised at this moment. It's waiting to see what's going to happen as a result of this. I think it's like any situation. There's going to be an opportunity, but there is also going to be a threat. So I think this is much wider than simply what next for Whitehall. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all the panellists for their thoughts. Lots of issues there: coordination, trust, capability, skills, leadership, morale. I'm going to forego the chair's privilege to ask the first question so we can get straight into questions from the floor. I'll take one or two at a time. Please let us know your name and where you're from, and ideally I'd like questions to specific members of the panel if possible, so that we can get through as many as possible. Do we have...
I'm David Walker. I'm one of James Will's slaves on Guardian Public. It's to Bernard. You've scored a great victory. You have reported several times in the PAC, Public Administration Committee, in favour of a more strategic capacity in government, a brain for government. Do you see this as an opportunity for perhaps turning the new unit into a much more strategic deliverer for a government which in a sense will have in many respects a tabula rasa? I mean, you could score 2 for 1 here by giving government, I mean, is this a potential model for how you might realise your critique of an absence of strategic government?
I think there is a danger in confusing two things here. I think strategic thinking is actually the antithesis of delivery. It's about gathering information from wider sources, processing and assessing that information more thoroughly and dispassionately, and employing more imagination about possibilities. I think there needs to be plenty of that as we approach these problems. But I think it would be a mistake to mix up what Ollie Robbins' capability needs to be doing, which is mobilising the whole of Whitehall. And I'm absolutely fascinated to hear what the other panellists said about this, and I'm scribbling madly, and the invitation to you is to help us write this little paper that's going to Oliver Letwin, I hope next week sometime. I think the idea of, I mean, the whole of this, it's very instructive to go back to the negotiations of when we went in the 1970s and to look at that model. I think the problem is, and I pick up this point about trust, and actually, Malcolm, I am one of those who is a tremendous fan of your capability to turn on a sixpence. I believe, and my first message conveyed back to the present Cabinet Secretary is, I believe you can do this, but there's plenty of people that think you can't. And I was in a meeting this morning where some people were saying, I mean, literally, somebody was saying, who has worked in Whitehall, that they're all incompetent, they're all morons, they can't think in front of their noses, and they've all got to get rid of and replaced. I mean, there is this agenda, and it's a view held by even some who are ministers, that we should have a much more American system. And I think this is a very important moment for the civil service from that point of view. That the civil service has actually got to approve it really is, in the sort of cabinet office, in the cabinet secretary's terms, impartial. It doesn't have a view. It's going to serve the new policy just as it did serve the old policy. And I think it's such an important opportunity for the civil service to demonstrate that the Northcote-Trevelyan model actually works. Sorry, that was an aside, but it's a very important point I wanted to make. And that will build the trust. But if ministers get in and feel that they're battling away and we're back to the mord warfare against civil service, that would be absolutely catastrophic. But I think that was possibly more about personalities than reality.
I should have said, by the way, if you're next door in the innovation room and you'd like to ask a question, do just come through. We've got another question over here.
My name is David Middleton, former chairman of the Institute of Economic Affairs. My impression is that the civil service, like the government, was taken completely by surprise by the referendum result. Am I wrong, or has any planning whatever been done before the result of the referendum?
Melanie, do you take that one?
I mean, you know, I wonder how many people in this room predicted the result. An honest show of hands. Not many. Okay. Sure. No, but I'm just saying. You asked, did we predict it? I'm saying I don't think many people predicted the outcome. What we did put in place, as you know, and Andrew referred to this earlier, is contingency planning around the financial markets, with which was done by the Treasury and the Bank of England, and I think, you know, that's clearly certainly been effective in the early days. It is very early days still. What we've now got to do, and as I say, you know, we've responded quickly. We've put in place the right people, and actually there's a lot of work that's gone on over the last few years. That means we've got a very good understanding of the areas where we need to do the work. I mean, this is not a blank sheet of paper. We are constantly engaging with the EU. We know exactly where the areas are of EU law that are there. We know what the big features of the negotiation are likely to be about, and we know what the detailed areas are likely to be about. All Whitehall departments who are involved in the EU in any way have that expertise and that knowledge. And as I said, it's also there in UCREP at their fingertips. What we've got to do is to brigade it and pull it together over the next couple of months so that we're ready for ministers to start to make decisions quickly. So, you know, yes, there is a very big task to do here. Was the country expecting this? I don't sense particularly that they were. It's a bit, you know, it's not my role to have been responsible for predictions, but I just come back to this, we've all collectively got to think about this together, and I think the civil service will be doing it. We were doing it in partnership with everybody else.
Julian?
I just want to say on the contingency planning piece, I mean, there is a lot of informal work and informal knowledge, as Melanie's talked about here, but I think that we do have to face, and around a general election, we very explicitly plan for outcomes, and we just have to be a little bit more mature, and we have to be clear that, you know, a government sets this, and something that stresses that the civil service is there and has a stewardship role for serving the offices of the government, not an independent role, but serving those offices is really, really important here. It's something the Institute stressed time and again. There are different interpretations about that. Some people stress the service of the individuals in those offices continually. Those are reasonable interpretations, but we've been exposed somewhat in the sense that Whitehall has not had a contingency plan. And that sense matters, whatever the reality of the fact that I think Whitehall has thought a lot about these issues and has huge amounts of knowledge within it.
Just four very brief points. One is that the civil service was instructed not to do any preparation. It was a deliberate policy of the government of the day, and maybe they should have taken their laptops home and worked in secret at night. One sort of hoped they did, but the green baize door, there was nothing behind it. This is the real deal, and that's what happened. Secondly, part of the reason for that was that if the machinery of government started to plan for the wrong outcome in the referendum, from the government's point of view, would that risk politicising the civil service, getting it drawn into a political debate, That might seem rather ironic, given how much the civil service machinery was drawn into the political debate before the 28 Purdah period was up, but that's another matter. I think the lesson of referendums, third point, is don't call a referendum unless you're prepared for the outcome that you don't want. I mean, that, and that underlines another point, I think, which is about the point about how we do this at general election time. I mean, there's no way, even before the Purdah period, the civil servants would become involved in the campaign in the run-up to a general election. They would remain impartial, and they would start preparing months in advance for the possibility of the alternative government being elected. That's under representative government. Our system is completely ill-adapted for direct democracy. We have no culture for this. And I think we're doing a wash-up inquiry into the referendum. And it looks like referendums are here to stay. Look forward to the next one. It is likely there will be other incidents of direct democracy, and I think we need to think very carefully about how we adapt our representative system for direct democracy, because we were singular. It is unforgivable, in my view, to let this happen again, for a perfectly reasonable outcome in a referendum to become as a complete strategic shock to the whole country and the whole system. And one sort of thinks maybe the Remainers wanted it to be a strategic shock so they could argue more forcefully that it would be a strategic shock. They've kind of made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. This can't be allowed to happen again in a future referendum.
I just want to say, you shouldn't confuse the absence of a plan with absence of knowledge and homework. Enormous amount of work was done. Lots of different trade models were identified, not helped by the fact that the levers themselves were unable to identify which of these models they actually preferred. There's also what happened after when we left the ERM. For the first few days, it was always about taking congé. We were leaving, and it was a matter of time when we would go back. Within about a week, that whole mood had changed, and you could have produced a plan about returning, but actually people, and probably Bernard was one of them who probably was right, said, never again are we going to get into a thing like that. So I think you have to wait until it happens, but actually be prepared with the sense of the ammunition and the building blocks to respond quickly. And that is a better position to be in than having a plan which may be a plan for the wrong contingency.
Can I again make a wider point here as well about, not about the planning, but about the expectation and the knowledge, whether people in the civil service were actually prepared for that. And if you look at the geographical map, and we've all examined and pored over that, I think there is a question about the actual makeup of the civil service, the places it's based in, whether it actually did have itself, the civil service as an organisation, as a federated organisation, a sense of this. I think there was a shock for everybody, but there is a question about whether the civil service itself, in its own organisation and in the way that it's organised, whether it actually is too metropolitan still. And we're discussing the move of the BIS office down from Sheffield down to London. I think that has to be a question, and I think there is also a much wider question about still the diversity in the civil service, and whether actually, and all kinds of diversity, and whether that hasn't actually played into the lack perhaps of knowledge again.
We don't have a quota for Eurosceptics in the civil service, do we?
They might come back on some of that later.
Dave Penman, the current General Secretary of the FDA. A couple of points and then a question. First of all, I think the idea of looking again at the kind of settlement between the civil service and ministers would be a mistake. I mean, if we look at the current political turmoil that we're facing, and if you add that into the idea that a whole swathe of the top tier of a department would go with a minister and would have to be replaced, I think that would create further difficulties. Secondly, I think on the issue of trust between politicians and civil servants, which is going to be vital going forward, I have to say some of the comments, including some of yours, Bernard, where you talk about the politicisation of the civil service during this campaign, is only really undermining that trust. And there was further comments made in Parliament on Monday, but that is going to be critical, I think, going forward. But I want to give you two facts that you put on your Twitter feed today, and that leads up to the question, which is that Fact 4 was between 15 and 55% of UK law is based on European legislation. I don't know how you can have a FAC that's between 15 and 55, but anyway, so I mean that gives you a sense of the scale of it. The other fact was the FCO is going to face a budget cut of about 45% in day-to-day resources over the next 5 years. Clearly, the spending review was not determined on the basis of the outcome of this referendum, both globally across the service and how it's impacting on one particular departments. And we have members who are working, 1 in 10 of our members are working the equivalent every weekend, 2 days a week, an extra 14 hours a week every single week to cope with where they are just now. Can this be delivered as a zero-sum game with no extra resources? And that's my question.
Melanie, do you want to start
Well,
with that?
because I think it's a good question. I said earlier, I don't think it's so much necessarily about size as about the right capability and about flexibility and agility. And I think that's what we've got to work through. And it's also going to be about the wider agenda. The rest of government and indeed a lot of parliamentary time will need to be devoted to this. And so there's going to be a question of the whole system and where we're putting our effort, and that will determine what the civil service has to do on other things as well. So that's got to be part of the picture, and I mean here, of course, the sort of policy-making Whitehall part of the civil service. But I think that question has to be one of the ones that we think through. Can I just respond to some of the other points about the nature of the civil service? I think, a big part of the civil service's role is to support ministers in their decision-making. And that is done a lot of the time from London. And I think it is a really important challenge for us, but it's also a challenge, actually, again, it's a collective one, to make sure that we're not too metropolitan and we're not too London-based. My own department works with local government, as you know, and as Andrew knows, because he used to run it. It does actually give us a lens on what's going on, and we have actually got an extremely effective partnership between BIS and DCLG, and we have a field force that's out there all the time, and I think it's, for me it's a bit of a model because it's collaborative across departments. It fuses Resource in the Centre in London with people who are out there who know all the stakeholders. They're very connected, and it's not very big. It's about 180 in total, serving both departments. And for me, it's a really good example of how you can achieve a lot if you focus on the task. And I mean, the final thing I just have to say, and I gave evidence to the Women and Equality Select Committee on Tuesday. I completely agree on diversity more generally. We are massively committed to that at the moment. We actually, I think, lead a lot, particularly on gender, in fact. But we know we've got an awful lot more to do, and you're absolutely right. And for me, a lot of these challenges are an opportunity to turbocharge some of what we know we need to do to improve the civil service, which actually our staff are pretty committed to, around diversity, around, actually more flexible, more interesting careers. And I think that's one of the things we've got to think about. And as chair of the People Board, and we've got a meeting next week, I think one of our responses to Brexit needs to be about how can we move a bit faster on some of this and get more collective more quickly.
Now, just a warning before I give Bernard a chance to come in on this one. In the interest of diversity, I'd like to take the next question from a woman. So the women can be thinking of their next question. Bernard, so can this be a zero-sum game and deliver?
I think we need more resources. I can't see how this is possibly done with the more resources. I appreciate the Permanent Secretary has to stick to the government's line to take. But I would be, if I was going to be the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the Cabinet Office supervising, I mean, it can't do without more resources. And it's ridiculous we're cutting the Foreign Office back. I mean, this is this is where we need a bit more strategic thinking. What we spend on the Foreign Office, it gets lost in the margin of error, over what we spend on pensions. I mean, I think the strategic thinking needs to be brought to bear on the spending regime, the spending decisions of this government. There's some very, very high value expenditure that are very small amounts, like Foreign Office expenditure, where I think to pare down the Foreign Office in the way we've done has been extremely destructive. Where we've been, incidentally, lavishing large sums on the External Action Service of the European Union, where they pay their diplomats much more and are building brand new embassies all over the world. We won't be doing that anymore. On this point about the politicisation, I do want to just pick this up because I have not been accusing any civil servant of becoming political. That is not what I've been complaining about. What I'm complaining about is the authority of the civil service or the resources of the civil service being used for political purposes. And there is a penumbra here that we need to be in the right place for, because what we don't want is for people to accuse civil servants of being political and say, when we change this policy, we'll have to get rid of him and him and her and her. That's what we don't want. And I fear that the people who are gunning for Sir Jeremy, for example, and there are plenty of Eurosceptics who think that we're going to have to get rid of Jeremy Hayward, I think they're completely wrong. But I think if the civil service gets too drawn into controversial matters, it is inevitable that that is going to be the reaction of people. That's the point. That's why I wrote that letter to the Financial Times during this campaign. I think Mark Carney I feel I could be excused for feeling, like millions of others, that Mark Carney did not want us to leave the European Union. He made it very clear to me that he was completely neutral. But I think civil servants and special advisors, I hasten to add, need to be careful what they say in public. They should not be drawn into matters of public controversy, albeit it is their job to support the government of the day and, where appropriate, make the case of the government of the day. I feel a rather old-fashioned restraint has been eroded, and the kind of also eroded with the unspoken understandings that used to exist between ministers and civil servants about what it was fit to ask civil servants to do and not do. I think we need to this is part of the trust agenda. We need to rebuild these understandings. We've got them half codified at the moment, and I think that in some way undermines what used to be understood. And we either codify the whole thing, or we try and rebuild an unspoken culture that these hidden understandings exist about how things work. I think this is a really big issue if we want to maintain the Northcote Trevelyan model in this world where we tend to write down our regulations and understandings and become rather legalistic about them. I think it's a huge challenge and a very big subject on its own.
Lady here.
Diane, my name is Deliberate Thinking. You've talked about leadership. Several of the speakers have talked about Whitehall's leadership role in this interim period when politics is in chaos. I wonder if you could say something about what that would look like and how we would know it was happening.
Who'd like to start? Julian, why don't you start with that?
I will take that, actually. Whitehall is collectively a set of departments quite often. Now, I'm sure people, many of us worked in there and we know that it can operate beyond that, but quite often we set up our system to be competitive between departments. One of the things that Whitehall has been doing, and very collectively doing over the last period, has been building up a leadership of the civil service. A concept that there is actually a civil service group that is responsible for leading the civil service. We got into a history where we became very departmentalised in our staffing arrangements and loads of moving people around and things like that. It was really great to hear Melanie say, look, we've become more collective in some of our staffing, some of our leadership arrangements, some of the stuff we did around legal as well as some of the stuff around commercial, which we're going to need to do a little more on, some of the stuff we're doing around finance, potentially some of the stuff we're doing around policy making. And just having that sense in Whitehall, that in one sense from the civil service side, there's a leadership of this organisation, set of organisations, which is there to serve the government, and we can move the people around and allocate them and agree how we're going to argue with each other, not just withholding facts and holding on to information, but actually let's get on the table because we need it and we need to have the debate. That's a move that's been made. There's a wider point, which I'm sure others will want to pick up on political leadership for Whitehall, which the civil service cannot substitute for. The prioritisation, the clear objectives have to come from the political side, and they have to deliver that now. There's no real alternative, because this is not a situation where some of the fudges we often do in politics will get you through. It's a real negotiation with people, there's outcomes, it's a real market out there, it has to believe in our fiscal position. There's no way around those things, and the politics will have to play into that.
It's been a senior civil service for 20 odd years. I have spent many hours in what used to be called SASC, Senior Appointments and Selection Committee, working out where you wanted to place talent, whether you needed to bring talent in, and it was done on a civil service-wide basis. So there's nothing new in the idea of a leadership that is common to both. Now, I think personally, compared with many other countries, there is a degree of coherence about Whitehall that many other countries will be extremely jealous of. And it comes particularly through this central leadership cadre that's been around, as I say, for years.
Okay. Next question just here.
Thank you. Dominic Morris, former civil servant, and now at Quiller Consulting. An observation and a question directed predominantly at Melanie and Andrew. Observation, I think that the civil service is still pretty damn good at policy making. But we are going to be getting back a whole raft of powers that require a lot of administrative delivery. Given our collective, rather patchy record, when you look at things like farm payment system and Luna House's ability to control the borders that we already allegedly control, what changes do you think will need to be made at the delivery end for all the new powers and the administrative systems that we're getting back?
Well, I think Melanie may want to comment as well. The initiatives that John Manzoni is working on increasing commercial skills, project management skills, procurement and so on, are precisely the same set of skills that we just will need more of. So I don't think anything kind of new in the sense of a completely new philosophy. We just need to do more of it and do it faster.
Yeah, so I think not that much that the EU administers for us actually. So, for example, take customs. We will need to set law in customs now. We will need to determine our own rules. But we actually administer the customs system already in the UK for UK customs receipts. So when I was at HMRC as Director General for Business Tax, it was one of my areas of responsibility. And so there may well be some areas, but I think there will be quite a lot in that intermediate kind of policy administrative space. I mean, these are the sorts of things we're going to have to work through. But as I say, administratively speaking, the EU doesn't do an enormous amount for us. So, for example, again, my department administers regional development funds. We will no longer be doing that within the EU system of rules. We will probably be doing it through another system. We might devolve it, we might do something else with it. It'll be one of the decisions we have to work through.
And just, I mean, we talked about the administrative systems and so on and so forth. Of course, the Whitehall's going to need even better technology than before. We haven't mentioned technology. Very important that actually civil servants have the technology they need to actually move fast, and that is something that John Manzoni and, of course, the government digital service is working on, and I think that'll become ever more urgent, won't it, to actually get those in place.
I agree with all that, but I think one of the big changes in the atmosphere in departments, I mean, ministers do say frequently that they want to do something, they decided to, no, you can't do that, this directive, that directive, there's that, you can't do this. And a minister, I think one of the reasons that more ministers became Eurosceptic, they found this very frustrating, and I think there's going to be an immense number of possibilities for departments to explore, which have been effectively closed off by membership of the European Union. I think that's going to be very exciting and liberating, and people might not feel excited about it now, but I think we can get people to think outside the box much more freely without some of those restrictions on departments.
There's one of these systems that people rail against, which would be very sad to lose, and that is the state aid system. If we don't have a state aid system, you imagine all these industries now are under pressure, and the temptation to say, well, we'll help this steel plant, we'll help that aluminium plant, that aluminium plant. The state aid system is the bulwark against that, and it is that competition piece that sort of, I was thinking of the Mario Monti bit.
We're going to have to show that some kind of self-restraint that has been imposed on us. Yes,
are we under political pressure? I mean, it is.
But if we subsidise our steel industry unreasonably, then we'll get punitive tariffs put on us. We've got to be very careful. We can't do that. But the whole question of how we deal with trade imbalance is another question. But I mean, you're quite right. We're going to have to show self-restraining ordinance. I mean, for example, all the environmental stuff. We want to carry over most of the environmental regulation that's in EU law into our own law and keep it. I mean, I don't want to chuck out. I mean, the idea. I don't want to be swimming in sewage again on the beaches in Clacton. It'd be ridiculous. We're going to want to keep a lot of this regulation because it's good for us, but it's going to be under our control.
Christopher Forster, Better Government Initiative. I'm speaking as myself very much today. I do believe that you should consider that very interesting things have been said, but whether or not being a bit too optimistic. We've had my neighbour here once that suggestion as to perhaps why you're being over-optimistic. But let me give another. You seem to be assuming that you've, if not all the time in the world, got plenty of time to make the arrangements necessary. The 2 months before you really have to start doing anything, and on. The having 2 years and even more than 2 years. There are all sorts of people out there who have different ambitions from our own. There are all sorts of private firms. What I think today's information coming in from the financial sector shows very clearly, yes, there's been a recovery in the FTSE and so on and so forth, but the pound is really far down. There are a great many reasons, I think, why we've had the up and down there, or the down and up. But there are very many reasons why a lot of firms will think of moving abroad, even more than before. And how we actually deal with that, they are saying, we want to know, one of the reasons, but many other reasons as well, as long as there's uncertainty in this country, we are very, very nervous about staying, and there are many arguments for going overseas. Similarly, there are an awful lot of countries, some within Europe and not, who will take every advantage, if possible, of our difficult position. So I really, perhaps I put the question in this sort of way. If there's a sense of crisis building up, maybe not, maybe I'm exaggerating, what then does Whitehall have to do, and how does the government deal with that?
Bernard, you wanted to come in on that?
Well, I think it's hideous that we've got this 3-month stasis in political leadership. Whether we should have all guessed that the Prime Minister was going to do precisely the opposite of what he said he was going to do, I have great respect for way he resigned and why he resigned, but leave the point at that. It's very inconvenient. Bring back Lord Salisbury, who used to take soundings and then tell the Prime Minister to advise the Queen who to send for. And it was over in a few hours. The point you make, though, I think is the right one. I mean, the idea that, as the government's been briefing, it could take 5 years to leave the EU, this is absurd. I think we need to move very quickly. I think we need to provide certainty, and we need to, the default for WTO trading rules with the EU, it's not going to be a massive disaster for this country. It's going to be a great opportunity. And we can do that. We don't need, this decision was not only leave the EU if you get a deal. This decision was leave the EU. And yes, we would like a free trade agreement with the EU. It may take some time to get it. But that is not going to be an essential component of our prosperity if they won't give it to us on terms acceptable to us, and it shouldn't delay our leaving the EU. I hope we can leave the EU in about 9 months. I don't see, put everything into these transitional provisions. As I say, even the customs union, put it into a transitional provisions. Let's deliver this decision for the British people of what they asked for, instead of extending and protracting this process in the hope that somehow you might be able to undo it, which one's rather suspicious that the people who want to take a long time over this. And we shouldn't spend 2 years in Article 50. That, as the former Cabinet Secretary just said, that as soon as we go into Article 50, we move into a position of disadvantage. We should say, look, let's have a 2-week completion period after we've negotiated a contract and just do it. And I think that would be much better for this country. And I sat down, forgive me a long answer, I bumped into a very senior leading business person who's got international businesses all over the world, who was just off to Numbers 10 to see the Prime Minister as part of his Business Advisory Council. And he had been having breakfast with a special advisor before going in, and I was introduced to him. And I sat down with him and I said, well, tell me what you think about this situation. He said, well, this is terrible. I'm spending all my time talking to Tokyo, Peking, and China, and Hong Kong, and Paris, and all that, trying to counsel all my 50,000 employees about what we're going to do about this. And I said, what do you think we should do? And he said, well, we needed some certainty. And I described to him the exit plan that I described to you at the beginning of this talk. And he said, why isn't anybody saying this? This is what we want. We want certainty. We want to get on with this. And I think that's what the government's got to do, and I hope we get a leader elected who's going to deliver that. Sorry?
Even 9 months is optimistic.
Well, it depends what you're going to try and achieve before you leave. If you've got very limited ambitions about what you try and achieve before you leave, you can leave very swiftly. If you are going to make, premise everything on you're going to leave, but the fact of leave is going to be premised on getting everything sorted out before you leave, well, I'm afraid that's probably what the Commission wants. We'll never leave.
Melanie, so the challenge, is there sufficient urgency in this civil services planning?
I think we are taking it forward with great urgency, and I mean, look, there's a balancing act to be struck here. I think there's two separate questions almost. What do we think the implications of this are, which I think is what you're partly hinting at, and have been in a way debating a little bit with Bernard. But then there's a question of, is this a big task? Yes, it is. It's a very big task. There is a lot of work to do here. There's going to be a lot of legislation, there's going to be a lot of practical implications, there's no question of that. And so, even if the negotiation is quick, there will still be a long tail of work beyond that. So we don't in any way, I don't want anyone to come away with the impression that we're underplaying the scale of that. But it's a slightly different question, I think, from what you think the implications are, which I just don't think I can really comment on. But I would say that I think not everything is clear yet, and it does depend quite a lot on the position that the government takes in the negotiations, clearly.
This lady here.
I'd like to ask Bernard Jenkins if what you've heard today is that they're already turning on a sixpence. Are you asking them to turn on a halfpence piece?
No, I'm not. This is a misunderstanding. I think the civil service can do this. I believe in our civil service. I'm telling you there are people who are looking for the system to ride for a fall because they want a different system. I want to defeat those people. I want to keep the Northcote Trevelyan system. Have I answered your question?
I just think in terms of, you're talking about building trust and asking people to do, it's got to be realistic.
I want Jeremy Hayward to stay. I think he can do the job. I think
and you have two very experienced people here who are telling you what's possible.
Yes. Sorry, I don't understand the point you're making. Have I missed something? I really don't understand the point you're making. I believe when we have a government that wants to deliver a Brexit policy, even the one that I'm describing, the civil service will deliver. Yeah. I believe they will deliver. That is my. I have faith in this system, and I'm saying actually this is the moment for the system once again to prove its worth. I remember Peter Hennessy's favourite one. There's three events there's three people that made the civil service what it is today. The Kaiser, Adolf Hitler and Margaret Thatcher is what he said. And I believe this is going to be one of those great occasions which is going to define what the civil service is and why it's such a world leader. That's what I believe.
Can I just say, look, it's stronger than that. There is only the civil service has the institutional capacity to deliver what we need delivering at this point. So we are reliant on that. And I do believe that it has skills and capability, huge depth in some of the key areas that we need to talk about. But I think Bernard is also right in saying the politics of some people within the government and the way they have run individual departments has led to questions about the very fundamentals of how we run the system. And I wasn't proposing that we should have a constitutional debate about this, but I was saying that if we have people who wish to run the civil service in a very different way and they become the central part of the government, then we have to face up to that reality and actually do it openly, not try to do it by pushing more and more people into departments and running small units around ministers, which make those departments dysfunctional. So, and that's a real risk, and we've got to be aware of it, we've got to talk about it. It may not come about because I think most politicians really value that very close role inside our departments where ministers are working with civil servants very directly. That's my experience, it's what virtually everyone says. But it is important because there's no option here. The civil service are going to be supporting the government in doing this, and we've all got to make that work.
This guy. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Matt Foster, Civil Service World. This is, I guess, a question really for Melanie. Prime Minister said he wants the brightest and best in the civil service to be in this new unit in the Cabinet Office. We've kind of already seen Ollie Robbins move from the second perm sec role that he was only really given last year. So what support is the centre going to offer to departments to kind of fill those vacancies that now arise as a result of the Brexit unit?
Well, this is what I mean about needing to think about those things collectively, and this is a very big, very important new priority. Sometimes you have to break a few eggs and move somebody out of a job that they were doing well, they'd only just started doing. That's the name of the game here, and that's what's been done to move Ollie across. I mean, as Andrew said, particularly on senior civil service resourcing, there is quite a long established sense of being able to do that across the piece. I think what I've been arguing is that we need to do that. We need to do it even more in earnest. That's what I was saying earlier. But I also think we do need to think about resources across departments at all levels as well, and make sure we've got them in the right places. And the tendency in any big system is to hunker down a bit and hope no one's going to come and ask you. I don't think that's the right response right now. I think we've got to be collective and be brave and come together. And I think that's what our people want of us, actually. And it's always difficult, this. So if you don't end up in the new unit, does that mean you're not bright and you're not the best? No, it doesn't mean that you're not bright and that you're not the best. And I'm very confident that I'm going to, DCLG has got a really big role to play here. For example, even though we've not got a lot of EU business, because we've got a housing market that we're still going to have some things we need to do with very actively. We've got local government sector to work with, where, as you say, Jane, there may be opportunities and also some risks we need to work through. So there's an awful lot of other work that will be going on, and we've got to balance that trick as a leadership across the civil service of making sure that the big priority, which we now have, is sufficiently well resourced and led, while also making sure that the rest of the world keeps moving too.
I'm just going to take one more question from the floor. Just there.
I wasn't going to ask this question because it takes us slightly beyond where we are. But we haven't mentioned immigration. Yet for about a third of the leavers, immigration was the issue. And it's sort of prompted really by what Bernard was saying. We have perhaps about 4 million EU nationals in the country at the moment, not registered. We had UKIP today talking about effectively treating them as hostages in terms of negotiations with the EU. If we take the road, I can understand the logic of what Bernard's saying. If we go down this road of a very quick break with the EU, with millions of people in the country whose status is completely uncertain, with people being led to believe, I never thought it would happen, but being led to believe that somehow all these migrants are going to go from their communities, etc. We're opening, and border controls which don't operate in a way that registers people in the way that you do perhaps in the States or other countries. Widening out from the role of Whitehall but into the sort of state structures and the civil service, how is this whole issue of migration and the status of those EU nationals, etc., where does all this come into the equation and into the wider politics of the debate that we've been having? Sorry to have raised this, but I think it's odd that we haven't touched at all on what was so central to much of the argument during the referendum debate.
One of the things which I disliked most in this campaign was the confusion of the word sovereignty, and control. Venezuela is a sovereign country and Zimbabwe is a sovereign country, but their ability to influence anything is near nil. And I think what has been offered is a false prospectus to people that we may change the rules, but if we can't get anyone else to work with us to enforce those rules, we will be worse off. And I personally think that the half of the immigration that doesn't come from the EU is being helpfully kind of absorbed by the great mass of the continental Europe. And I think that it is quite likely that if we get a better handle on EU migration, we will actually be in a worse position to control the immigration from elsewhere. We will no longer have the cooperation of the Italian Navy or whoever else is operating around the Mediterranean, and the French will get fed up with Solgat and simply put people on the trains, and we will have the camps in Folkestone. And that's a case where you think you have got sovereignty, but actually you lose control.
I just think this is definitely taking us into a whole another set of issues.
I need to answer this for two reasons. First of all,
briefly,
Cabinet Secretary, please don't let's carry on fighting the Remain and Leave campaigns. And I think there is a danger in this. It's clear what side you were on, and we shouldn't be doing this. We should be thinking about what we're going to pursue. Secondly, personally, I think one of the most unsatisfactory things is the Prime Minister stands at the statch box and says nobody's status is going to be changing immediately. I mean, we're dealing with 4 million people whose livelihoods, whose homes, whose families, this is really directly affecting them. And I actually bumped into the Prime Minister today and I said, this cannot be the line to take. And he said, oh, well, I can't make any policy. Well, I think actually if he's going to hang around as Prime Minister in person for the next 3 months, he can't just say, oh, I'm just going to all leave it to the next Prime Minister. He's got to have a policy. That's why we have a Prime Minister, to have policies. And I think he should just tell the leadership candidates, I'm Prime Minister, this is the commitment I'm going to make to these 4 million citizens. They are going to stay in the UK. Those who are here are going to stay in the UK. All those from this date, set a date, are going to be entitled to stay in the UK, and their rights, whatever rights they've acquired as members of the EU, as citizens of the EU, living in this country, they will retain. And we will expect our EU partners to do the same for British citizens in the EU. Now, if the EU is stupid enough not to give the same reciprocal undertakings to British citizens in the EU, that will reflect badly on them. At the moment, I feel it reflects very badly on us. And the idea that we're going to subscribe to the Farage policy, who I think is a revolting politician, incidentally, and demonstrated that in the European Parliament graphically the other day, I think it should be the easiest thing in the world for all the leadership candidates to say that we're not going to subscribe to that view. Thank you for asking the question. I feel very strongly about it, as you can see.
I think we can all agree that the referendum campaign raised issues where it's clear that there's a conversation that is now going on in the country and a conversation which is relevant for government, and that there's going to be a question moving forward about how those conversations are managed. So I think we'll save that discussion for another day. We've had a very wide-ranging discussion. I was going to just finish by giving you each the opportunity to...
Is it necessary?
No? Okay.
Count me out, I've had my say.
Okay. In that case, I will just say thank you very much to the panel. Can we thank them in the conventional way? And say we've raised a lot of issues today which the RFG is going to be exploring in the coming days, weeks, months, and we'll be holding some further events, so look out for those, and we look forward to seeing you there in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you.